Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is in your part of the world. Thank you for joining us today. If you have joined us before, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, I hope you like what you see. I like to start with a quick introduction of the ICCP before we get started. So, who is the ICCP? What are we and what do we do? Well, we are a professional members organization that recognizes those with the skills, qualifications, and expertise in the professional management of construction claims. We have three primary objectives, which are to establish international professional standards in the management of claims, to give recognition to those who have gained that knowledge and skills, and to help and educate those who would like to gain the experience in the professional management of claims. And why is there the need for the ICCP when there are so many professional organizations in the construction industry? Well, quite simply, construction claims have become a key part of the international construction industry, and claims professionals come from many aspects of construction, from engineering, quantity surveying, project management, legal, etc. And so until the ICCP, there has been no organization that met the needs of claims practitioners. So no one recognized those who have the specialist knowledge, experience, and skills in managing, preparing, and responding to claims to the highest level of professionalism. So I will quickly introduce that we have an elected steering committee. We have our executive officer and an elected president and 3 elected fellows. And our general manager, Nina, is currently on maternity leave, so I am taking her place. In terms of membership, we have 3 levels of individual membership, which each have their own set of criteria. We also have student and graduate memberships for those who are seeking their first qualification. And we have a corporate membership for companies that either specialize in claims or have dedicated claims departments. And if you are interested in more information than that, we will be presenting a webinar on corporate membership in July. So watch this space. In terms of member benefits, we have a private members area of our website that has a collection of articles, research, white papers, etc. We have information on education, higher education. We also have information on training opportunities around the internet. Our bookshop does not sell books like our training and education sections. Those provide information in one spot about the latest releases. We have a growing library of practical templates, which allows our members to ensure that their claims are put together to the highest standard while also saving time. We have regular CPD webinars such as this one. Most of our webinars are open to the public. However, a CPD certificate is a benefit of membership. Our ICCP Academy are training webinars that are not open to the public, and these are more technical in nature. Additionally, we have discounts on books through Wiley Blackwell and Routledge, as well as training through our training partner, Claims Class. We have a monthly newsletter to keep our members up to date on what's going on around the industry. We also offer industry exposure in the form of a public listing of members, as well as all members receiving logos and certificates. Additionally, we have a private LinkedIn group where our members can discuss their contracts and claims questions with other professionals and get the benefit of the expertise of our members. And we have the optional benefit of the Register of Claims Practitioners. This is a popular benefit with our consultant members. And each member who joins the register gets their own webpage to advertise their services. Okay, I realized that was very fast. If you requested additional information when you signed up for this webinar, I will be getting in touch with you with more information. If you did not ask for additional information, but now you would like more, you may visit our website, instituteccp.com, or email me directly, jennifer.smith@instituteccp.com. And one final thing before I hand it over is we will be hosting our first conference. It will be a half-day conference on Zoom on the 20th of September, and you can find out all about it on our website. This is free for members, so any member who would like to attend just needs to email me. And until the 14th of July, non-members can get an early bird rate of £40. All right, and with that whirlwind tour, I'm going to hand it over to a return guest. This is Krzysztof, who I have mispronounced his name, and I apologize, but my American tongue will not do the correct pronunciation, I don't think. And he has started his career in civil works management and is currently a consultant with rapportconsulting.com. All right.
Okay, so good morning. I appreciate your presence here and I hope you'd enjoy it. Let me share the screen firstly. Fine. So I'm Krzysztof Klimaszyk. It's how I pronounce it in my language. So I'm independent delay and quantum expert, and I usually serve as the negotiator, claims manager, or advisor on different construction sites. And the most I like, probably as you do, the arbitration cases. It's not a secret that ordering party wants everything at the contract price. At the same time, the contractor wants to execute minimum work in the most convenient manner. And this different perspective of parties ignites disputes very often. Such cases usually ends up with the kind of disappointment or discovery of issues missed during negotiation. With this short webinar, I'd like to consider procurement pitfalls and claims arising out early at the project commencement. Let us go through four following topics. I've chosen to start the next project with more grounded approach. And the first would be the right to determine on sequence, second, fast track schedules, third, reliance on the estimated quantities, and the fourth, resolution of ambiguities. And I will jump over court cases with short comments only, just because the webinar will be posted later than on YouTube. So if somebody wants, then could go back and review it on YouTube. Finally, it would be my pleasure to discuss your questions. Sometimes the late agreements, decisions, lacking access, or flawed drawings lead to the situation where the best mitigation measure is to resequence the work. Since the contractor within his bid have considered some optimum sequence of work, such resequencing may require some additional technical measures or extend the timeline beyond the initial assumptions. I got few examples similar to the cases I personally faced, and these are probably the simple ones. And the first is something like the small plant, could be the gas compressor station or small heat combined plant, where the contractor intended to start with the underground network, so from the bottom, then perform internal roads and then foundations. But if the underground network's design is late, we might start with internal roads, but after then the roads would need some corrections after underground installation. So that's the kind of additional thing and change of sequence. The second example could be liquid gas tank, where the steel dome is usually raised up with the suspended ceiling hanged below. But if the ceiling materials are not on time, we can raise the dome alone to allow to proceed with internal works on time. But later then hanging on the suspended ceiling at height would bring some extra cost. And the third and last example could be as simple as schedule of construction of gas pipeline or the road. Such projects are usually carried out in the manner in order from the first section to the last one. So if we got to skip some section just because lacking access, we got to move back and forth. Sometimes it might need some technical measures like the temporary pipeline for pressure test. So with all these cases, unless otherwise stated in contract, the courts imply the contractor's right to determine his own sequence. It relies on the assumptions that, as said before, the contractor within his bid considered some certain cost-efficient sequence and the method of work. Such could be also called as the ordering party duty not to hinder, or the unjust enrichment if the service or that additional service is beyond the contract consideration. So however you call it, it is the same thing, like a change of sequence. And I've brought 5 cases to support it. First is G Industries versus New York State Department of Transportation, where the urban highway construction schedule had to be significantly modified. It was due to discovery of the large diameter pipeline along the highway that was not disclosed previously. It caused necessity for the project restaging, limited available space, and required use of equipment different than expected before. So although the Department of Transportation was allowed to alter the contractor's plans, the necessary restaging was recognized as significant change and compensation was granted. The second case is the residential building. Due to the ground conditions problem, the general contractor ordered to divide the residential building and shift in time construction part thereof. Additional structural and safety measures increased the cost and the compensation was granted. And the third case is ACG versus Southeast Elevator, where the general contractor imposed on the elevator supplier necessity to drill wells under the hydraulic elevators only after building was constructed. It prevented use of the cheaper method that need big machinery and appropriate access and could be performed only prior to the building construction. It was recognized that the general contractor and owner knew about the intended method, but they missed the schedule, so the claims for the change of sequence were granted. Another cases, if you want to look for, might be the Heller Electric versus William F. Klingensmith or Youngdale and Sons versus United States. And so we could see that the right to determine on sequence is usually respected by courts, and the key factor to success with such claims would be the pre-announcement of the intended sequence or method, example through offer, schedule, or the contract amendment, or in some way. At the other hand, the claims for the change of sequence might be waived when the baseline sequence was not reasonable, or the contractor couldn't follow it, or maybe the contractor encountered some concurrent delays, or maybe the contractor missed the yearly warning obligation, so the ordering party could not participate with mitigation or oversee mitigation, or whether the contractor failed to comply with duty to mitigate, and for example, he did not choose the most efficient means when resequencing. So it's not allowed to pile up damages. So my recommendation from the right to determine on sequence is firstly to announce the intended sequence and pay attention to it when you are ordering party. The second issue, if you are about to deliver something in flight, for example, decision or drawings, my advice is to keep time contingencies, and some issues like the unexpected objects or different ground conditions might be hard to or unavoidable. So you got to work out best mitigation measures. And I mean, by you, I mean the contractor and the ordering party together, to be sure that it's performed at the lowest cost. Another issue might sound very basic to you, but I've already faced it a few times, and it always had a severe impact. So I think let's talk about it. Sometimes the ordering party, usually general contractor, order to follow the schedule without contingencies between subsequent contractors. It does not account for the common entitlements for the extension of time, like quantities increase, unexpected works, or design flaws. These are usually risks borne by EPC contractor and hard to transfer to build subcontractors just because of proximity issue. The EPC contractor is the one who controls quantities, who estimated, who issued drawings, and who is responsible for the unexpected work. Sometimes the owner is also responsible for the unexpected works. And actually, these three examples are very common on sites. So whenever you don't have time contingencies, there's the problem, because you got to settle with we got to settle with the subsequent contractors, we got to talk about it, we got to negotiate the price increase. If we got some time contingencies, we could manage the delays effortlessly. And if they look at the graph, I put into schedule some small contingencies, as I think it's a proper safeguard for such situation. If the only mean to make a construction faster and safe on fast construction is to cut off contingencies, it wouldn't add up good. Once I've observed the construction schedule that was not aligned with the engineering. I don't know the idea behind it, but the contractor had to wait on site for every piece of drawing, and sometimes very last detail was crucial to placing an order. Although you can somehow mitigate the delays between subsequent construction works, because something is going on site and they're in the middle of construction, usually there is no problem with drawings, and you can slow down the pace of one contractor and slow down the pace of the subsequent contractor and somehow align it. When there is no contingencies between the engineering and construction phase, it usually brings a lot of mess and hurts. But just because at the beginning, usually contractors are about to start with the critical path, with the first critical and the biggest work. So if the drawings are not ready, they got to encounter standby. So the cost grows, frustration grows. You cannot hide it anyhow because the costs are apparent and nothing progress on site. So it's usually lead to dispute. And sometimes in the worst case scenario, the contractor may consider to abandon the project prior to any engagement, like the financial engagement or the work engagement, if there is so much problems with the scheduling recognized early. My recommendation in such cases is simple as to keep contingencies within the schedule and to anchor the subcontractors with slightly shorter timelines when requesting for a bid. It may help. Let's move to another issue that could happen early on. No doubt you cannot be so precise early on, so initially estimated quantities could vary on the final designs. It brings two issues one must be aware of. The first is the extension of time, and the second is re-rate of price. Same issue of inaccuracy of estimated quantities might sound very obvious to you, but some people forgot it, so I find it worth to talk about it. And the extension of time issue happens only when the quantities increase. It followed the suggestion from SEL protocol that the duty to mitigate does not extend to requiring the contractor to add extra resources. And for example, the similar is with FIDIC. It allows to extend the timeline whenever quantities increase. So whenever quantities increase, the key issues to recognize is whether your enlarged activity is critical and whether its duration depends on the quantity. For some activities, when we got the limited resources, quantities is strongly dependent on the duration is strongly dependent on quantities, like piles driving strongly depends on the number of piles, or depth, months on reworks, or wide excavation. Contrary, some activities duration might be independent to quantities. For example, when you are about to erect the steel structure, it rather depends on the number of lifted elements, not on its weight or the thickness of that element. So you got to recognize it to don't give the unjustified extension of time. So yeah, if the quantities increase, I recommend to firstly look at your, to be safe in front of that issue, I recommend to firstly distinguish the critical activities which depends on the quantities within your schedule prior to the procurement, and assure that the particular contractor would be ready to add extra resources or work overtime if quantities increase, just to achieve the planned durations. And at best, keep it within your negotiation protocols, and or somewhere in the contract. And the last instance in this case is to keep the time contingencies. The next issue might be the hardest to explain from all of these topics, are the issue of re-rates. So sometimes the quantity variation might bring the need for re-rate the price, and it depends strongly on your contract terms. So consider it carefully. Usually some portion of fixed cost, or the cost that depends on the contract duration, are distributed, and of course expected profit is distributed among the schedule items. So you can look at the upper table. It's something like a cost breakdown where there are items, and it's direct costs, so maybe supplier cost, and there are the fixed costs like the overheads of office, and there's profit, and the lower table got the fixed cost and the expected profits distributed among the scheduled items. So if the baseline quantities vary, the contractor might get extra profit or be deprived of. And yeah, if he signed the contract, he is somehow entitled to the initially expected profit, unless otherwise stated in your terms. So it needs a re-rate. From the other side, we could look at the graph where the horizontal axis is the quantity with the baseline quantity marked in the middle, and the vertical axis is the total price. The orange line is the quantity multiplied by the baseline unit price. Let's call it rough price, and the blue line is the blue line actually accounts for and keeps firm the fixed cost and the expected profits. It slightly got lower slope, but also if the quantities goes to zero, the contractor would be entitled to some kind of expected profit and fixed cost. So as the quantities vary from the baseline quantity, the rough price gets less and less justified. If the quantities increase, the contractor could get an extra profit or extra fixed cost. If the quantities decrease, the contractor might be underpaid because he would not get the profit. The re-rating is all about keeping fixed cost firm and sometimes also profit firms. It depends on the contracts. For example, if some kinds of contracts, if the force majeure arise, the contractor would be entitled only to the increased costs. So getting paid by the unit prices that are in the schedule might be unjustified because it contains the profit and the fixed cost, while the compensation of direct cost would be highly appropriate. So such procedure need an examination of how the rates will were built up during the bidding. And the Maeda Hitachi joint venture versus Hong Kong verdict and other recognizes such re-rating procedure. So if you want, make a print screen here. If you want the additional similar verdicts, you could go to the Hudson Engineering contracts, or I can provide you some other verdicts. The important issue with this is to break down the rates, but be careful, the bids doesn't have to be balanced. So as the Syst Construction versus State Electricity Commission of Victoria explains, or highlights, the contractor to leverage his benefits may put lower rates to items likely to decrease, and put the higher rates on the items likely to increase, so to get more profit if it's something is about to rise. So my advice here is to verify whether a bid was balanced, and as the contractor, keep the pre-bidding records. So if you need to review it or go back and break down the offer, it would be easy available and would protect your profits. And for sure, make some clause on the re-evaluation or the valuation, or what's going to happen when the quantities increase or decrease. Okay, let's move to the next and the last issue. It's about ambiguities. It's hard to avoid it within the volumes of specifications. There are a lot of rules, but the two I find the most often used for the resolution of the disputes. The first is that the parties' subjective intentions are generally irrelevant, so the meaning should be resolved through the eyes of the reasonable reader. So if the ordering party is trying to force the contractor to follow their subjective interpretation, it might be against that rule. And the second rule is, if there is no other appropriate resolution to ambiguity, it should be resolved contra proferentem, so against the party who wrote the ambiguous specification. Here, for your information, I tried to outline the other common rules, like the ambiguities might be resolved as the course of the current performance of contract. So be careful whenever you make some small concessions to the ambiguities, and make kind of disclaimer to don't let it be taken as the course of performance. And the another rule is that the party should not be entitled to be relieved from the consequences of its own breach. So whenever you want to confuse the contract or confuse dispute with the ambiguities just to protect yourself, it might be ineffective. There's the plain meaning rule, and there's a rule that special conditions take precedence over standard or general ones in the case of ambiguity or conflict. And there are others. So if you would look for some insights, you could take a look at it, or just make a print screen here, or later then on YouTube. I just want to have a few words about the patent ambiguity clause, because it's very interesting. It's against the common contra proferentem rule. Such clauses oblige the bidding party to inquire about apparent ambiguity, to clarify it before any detrimental reliance occurs. So if the bidding party doesn't, then it might be resolved against the bidding party. So it's called patent ambiguity. But that rule got also exceptions whenever the ambiguity is neither glaring or substantial or patently obvious. It should be resolved against like contra proferentem. So it's called the latent ambiguity. To conclude from the ambiguities, my advice here is to have the patent ambiguity clause within your contract, just to protect some abuse of the obvious ambiguities. It might extend the procurement, but gives kind of protection. Such clauses also, I've forgotten to say, common within the public procurement in the US. And yeah, you got to still be careful because the latent ambiguities does not fall under that clause. To sum up, webinar, it's kind of short, but the issues were simple and some kind of there were different of each other. So first of all, be aware if your deliverers might impose some sequence on the contractor, and discuss it and keep time contingencies for it. Consider this scenario of what happened if your supplier would be entitled to extension of time, whether it would have an impact on subsequent contractors or not. Check whether your subcontractor would be able to increase resources and write it down within your contract. At best, keep the time contingencies at least small, just to avoid the little problems, or sometimes small contingencies could help with the bigger problems. And the fifth point is to include the patent ambiguity clause. With this, I'd like to finish this webinar. If there are any issues I thought about that need some clarification, you could write to me. And I guess if there are any questions, we can move to it.
Okay, thank you. Short and sweet. We do have a question. How can we assess the duration for unforeseen ground conditions to be considered in the schedule?
Okay. It will be hard because when there are some unforeseen ground conditions, you don't know what would be the mitigation measure, and which means you're gonna use to mitigate it. But first of all, you got to consider whether it's a project like the pipeline or the road that it's spread across the long road. So the unforeseen ground conditions could happen in the one section. So it's not a problem because you got to, you can skip it and just save some financial contingencies for moving back and forth. Whenever you are looking at it for the under the residential building, my advice would be to somehow arrange with the contractor or the subcontractor that he would wait to recognize how the ground conditions are, or whenever the contractor is performing excavation and subsequently the concrete works, usually contracts allow the entitlements for the cost, but not the profit, because it's kind of force measure. And with if there is contractor for the excavation and concrete works, maybe you can wait with the hiring contractor for the installation of or for the electrical part until the ground conditions are recognized. So you got to be creative about it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And that was our only question. So if anyone else has a question, speak now or forever hold your peace. While anybody has their last chance to ask a question, I will just say that earlier this month, we had a webinar on termination claims, and it ran to an hour and 45 minutes because that is obviously a very complex issue. And in fact, there were so many unanswered questions that the presenter, Uditha, has agreed to come back next month and do a construction clinic. It is possible that the entire time will be spent answering unanswered questions from the previous session, but any additional time he will be answering additional questions. That will be in the third week of July, but the exact date has not been decided. Okay, and we do have another question that's come in. So can you explain what is contingency in the baseline program?
Okay. the contingencies is simply the spare time between, or the kind of float between one activity and another. It's appropriate to do not schedule so if that one contractor ends up on Monday and on Tuesday another starts. So the contingency is simply a week or two, or the appropriate time between one and another to just proceed with the work smoothly. Yeah. And yeah, there are another questions. See.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you. Another question on the same topic: who owns the contingencies?
Okay, so let me put it this way. Whenever you are about to hire some contractor, you could put on him some milestones. And if there's some contingencies after that milestone, prior to the next subcontractor within your schedule, you own it, because the subcontractor is restricted by the milestone. Whenever there is a contract that the general schedule is spread across different contractors, they are allowed to use it freely. Then the contingencies are usually attributed to the party who firstly utilize it. So within the procurement, you got to carefully use the milestone that could make the penalties or put the penalties on the party, and that's how you could reserve the contingencies for your own and for unexpected problems and for risk that the EPC contractor is responsible.
Okay, thank you. And another question on the same topic: can it be in the critical path?
Yes, it's not a problem. I mean, the theory says that the critical path is the path without time contingencies, but it's up to you. If you know that you got to start with the engineering, then construe the biggest foundation, that put the turbine on it, and then connect it somehow. It is actually the critical path. And if you put the time contingencies between the engineering and the foundations, just to be sure that another work fronts of engineering would help, or when the contractor wants to start with the bigger amount of works at the very beginning at once, there's gonna be the contingency at the critical path. So basically between the other contractors, and even if you are executing food foundations, you can make a break during the holidays whenever you are allowed, and that's gonna be on the critical path.
Okay, and that same person who asked that last one about the critical path also asked, but the engineer can comment, do you agree?
Okay, I need to know what was the first question.
It was the previous question about the critical path.
Yeah, engineer can comment on it. And yeah, whenever you assume that you got some time contingencies and it would be used, for example, for the engineer who is like a third party or the owner, because they might be a little late with a decision, it's not a problem. They can utilize it too for their own purpose. So, and such cases, it would be like the concurrent use of contingencies, because one party would be late with kind of agreement or decision, and the other party would use that contingencies for designing of something. So yeah, it's later than it's about the delay analysis, and whenever the owner or engineer contribute to delays, or but for that late decision, it could be proceeded faster than all about evaluation later than a specific case, but the engineer could point out the contingencies, could try to force the contractor to proceed faster, but sometimes cutting off the contingencies doesn't mean it's gonna be faster. It could be more costly, I would say.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, for example, due to the visa problems of the managers for the related personnel working in the field, how can we explain the cost rate about loss of productivity?
Okay, it's not strictly about this webinar, but the but the usually loss of productivity is explained by the measured mile analysis. So you compare the productivity at the beginning and the productivity in the middle of project when it's not disturbed, when there is no appropriate period that you can compare it to, then you can compare it to the baseline assumption and argue that it was reasonable. So my advice is to look for the measured mile method to explain the loss of productivity. Yeah, and that could be the first measure that would entitle you to extend the time.
Okay, thank you. The next question, in a back-to-back contract, a subcontractor is ahead of schedule while the main contractor is late. Can the subcontractor insist on early takeover by the main contractor? If not, will the main contractor be liable for any maintenance of the subcontractor's work since he's late?
Okay. So it's a matter of contract terms, I think, but whenever the subcontractor can perform its own part and it's only about the handing over the work and the subcontractor wants to, don't know, leave the site without any financial advantage and just hand over the elements or the construction objects, I think it's not a problem to take it over. But if it's about the also commissioning, so the subcontractors have to wait for the main contractor just to start the commissioning of their both elements at the same time, maybe it's the main contractor. Yeah, the main contractor might be liable, but the liability, I would say, would be restricted to some financial compensation. If the subcontractor is kind of specialist in the field and they bring some specialized equipment and got to start it up, it's no force that would force the main contractor to, don't know, start it up on his own. Just the subcontractor got to be paid extra if the main contractor is actually late according to the schedule. But if he follows the schedule, but just the subcontractor is earlier, the subcontractor still got to comply with the previously agreed schedule.
Okay, thank you. The next question is quite vague, so I'm going to come back to that. The next question is in three parts. First part, is contingency not like the float? If that's the case, then it should go against the definition of a critical path, not so?
Yeah, contingency is almost like a float, because yeah, the float is like a theoretical definition, and it usually, when you consider critical path, it refers to the not critical path that's got a float, and somebody could move the activities forward on executed later or earlier. Contingencies, I mean something that is the float or time that you reserve for something special. For example, the risk of quantity increase, so you restrict your subcontractors to finish kind of like week or 2 weeks earlier, just in case of quantities increase. So it's a time that you assume that nothing happens, but you restrict it. Float is like more movable and you could freely move it. Contingencies is for the purpose, but it's like theoretical.
Okay, and then carrying on with the same question, if that is the case, then the question about the handover will depend on the subcontract, correct? So that's the previous question. Yeah.
Yeah. If you can rephrase it somehow, because don't get the point of this question, so I could respond or later and we could talk on LinkedIn, so I would help.
I think he's asking about that previous question that was about the handover when the subcontractor finishes early. So would that
okay. So if
depend on the contract?
if the main contractor delay handover, yeah, he should be liable to towards the subcontractor if it extend the agreed timeline.
Okay. All right. Let me clear some of these questions out. And Christian, if that wasn't completely answered, please. Oh, yes, sorry. If that wasn't completely answered, then please add more. And Christian, who had asked about the subcontract and the main contractor, says thank you for the response. So now our very broad question: how can we deal with any claim or dispute that arises in general?
Okay, so my general advice would be just to stay calm, review all the details, because sometimes the emotions plays too much role. And if you go to the details and encourage the parties to build kind of rapport and express their position and freely exchange the ideas why they believe to have a claim, you are like few steps ahead and you could go straight to the resolution or get the range of possible resolutions. So talking and engaging parties and building rapport, it's my primary advice. And the other are like technicalities. I bet you got to be knowledgeable, you got to know what to look at. Yeah, but dealing with claims, always when you get the information from the parties, it could be easy to ask somebody else to make a comment about it, to help you to evaluate. But yeah, getting information, recognizing the position of parties is the crucial. I think in general, that would be my advice for now. Maybe it will change over time, but.
And Christian also offered the suggestion of a DAB as a good way to deal with disputes.
Could be, but when you got a good claims manager on site, it depends. So
there we go. I think the best thing is to have a good claims manager on site.
Yeah, it could be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It looks like you have worked your way through all of the questions. So yeah, thank you for a great presentation today.
Yeah, thank you for your presence. I appreciate it. Was time for you. I was happy when presenting it, preparing. I'm happy that somebody listened to and maybe it was interesting. So if there were questions, it's more, yeah, better. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. And for everyone who attended, thank you very much. And as I said, I should be settling today when the follow-on presentation on termination claims will be held. So I'll be sending that information around and on the usual social media platforms. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. Y'all have a great day. Oh, wait, sorry, 2 more questions. Oh, no, they all just said thank you.
I appreciate it.
Everyone for attending. All right, bye.
Bye.